may be seated. In Joshua chapter 6, the power of God, the faith of the Israelites brought the walls of Jericho down. I figure the only part of the wall that's still there, somewhat intact, is the place where Rahab and her family were. The cord, the scarlet rope may still be hanging outside that window. But the destruction was complete. Everyone perished except for Rahab and her family. Everyone else is dead at the end of the day, and the city was burned. And Joshua right there pronounced an oath and a curse, as the end of chapter 6 says. At that time, Joshua said this, cursed before the Lord is the one who undertakes to rebuild this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundations. At the cost of his youngest, he will set up its gate. And it prophesied just like that, and it happened just like that during King Ahab, evil King Ahab's day. And it's recorded in 1 Kings 16. It says it happened to Hiel of Bethel. Now, how does this whole Jericho story spread through the land? And what are people saying? And what do they think of Israel, Israel's God, and Joshua? Verse 27, the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the whole land, as everyone was surely talking about him and them. That's how chapter 6 ends. It all ends smelling like roses for the Israelites. The story of Jericho is a smashing success, but sadly it doesn't end there. It takes a terrible turn, chapter 7. As we turn to chapter 7, it all begins with a but. But the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. The people were unfaithful. This is their first stop in Canaan. It's their first battle of many. It's the first test of obedience. And how did they do? They failed. What did they do wrong? Well, the Lord had already told them when they walked into Jericho, everything there was devoted to Him. Everything there was His, not theirs. Don't take it. Back in chapter 6, verse 18. Keep away from the devoted things so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into His treasury. That's what Joshua told them. So all they had to do was walk in and take it, all of it, for Him. God brought down the walls. They just walked in and took everything there for Him. That was the command. That was the order. That was their duty. And did they do it? No. They were to walk in and take it for Him, everything devoted to Him. And it couldn't have been more clear. It should have been crystal clear, as well as the warning. Nobody could have missed it. If anyone, I mean anyone, took anything, I mean anything, to quote the Lord, it would bring about your own destruction and would make the camp of Israel liable to destruction. Can anybody misunderstand that? But the temptation to just take a little was too much for one man. He was a nameless figure among the crowd, I guess, just one of the Israelites, one of the soldiers. Everybody walks in, and all the people are taking these things that will be for God, for His honor, but one man can't take it. So one man takes it. Just a few things, but he takes it. Who is he? Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zimri, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took just some of them, and the Lord's anger burned against all of Israel. The man can't help himself. He heard what everybody else heard, but he couldn't do what everybody else did. Everyone was doing what the Lord had said, but one man, and one man ruined everything. The Lord had been abundantly clear what should and should not happen and the consequences of such actions either way, and Achan heard it and went ahead and took it. Just a few things. Because of that, the Lord's anger is burning. Of course it is. The disobedience from His people, of course He does. And while Achan is sitting on his little secret and God is seething with His righteous anger, Israel has disobeyed Him, and you now know more than Israel did. You know what Achan and God alone know. you're privy to the story that even Joshua doesn't understand. So Joshua does what he thinks he should do. He prepares the army for the next city. The next city is not as big as Jericho. Jericho is a big city with lots of people and humongous walls. Those walls fell. They demolished the city, burned it. Everyone was dead, and all the stuff was the Lord's. That's what he thought. The next city has 2 letters to describe it. The name is 2 letters. How big can a city be when the city is 2 letters long? Ai. And if God did to Ai what God did to Jericho, Ai is nothing. Ai is easy. Joshua had already been given the marching orders, so he goes and sends the spies into Ai as he did with Jericho. And they come back and they say what is obvious. It's a small city. You surely don't need to do much. I mean, send 3,000 people at most and they'll conquer them. There's hardly anybody even living there. I don't think that's arrogance, it's experience. They trusted God. They knew what God just did in Jericho. With some marching and some shouting, the walls came down. How hard could this be? So Joshua did what they recommended, sent 3,000 soldiers to this small city with 2 letters to describe its name, and they lost. They were routed by the people. The people of Ai must have come out at the city gates and pushed them back and chased them off. And they ran away from the city and into the stone quarries and down the slopes. And that's at the slopes where the people cut them down. 36 Israelites died. 36. Maybe you say that's not many. But when it should have been 0, as it was in Jericho, that's too many. And if you knew the men who died, you would have said that's too many. And why? It's a hit, it's a blow, it's a loss. Verse 5 says, at this, the hearts of the people melted in fear. Of course they did. They became like water. The once strong men who conquered a city with God's will and faith now had weak knees. Why? They were surely asking. Why? And that's what Joshua would love to know. He doesn't understand. He's devastated just like everyone else. Heartbroken, confused, throws himself at the Lord's mercy. Starting in verse 6, Joshua tore his clothes, and he fell face down to the ground before the ark of the Lord, remaining there till night. The elders of the Israelites, they did the same thing and sprinkled dust on their heads. And Joshua said, listen to his prayer. Oh, Lord. Alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites, to destroy us? If only we had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Pardon your servant, Lord. What can I say now that Israel has been routed by its enemies? The Canaanites and the other people of the country will hear about it, and they'll surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. And then what will you do for your own great name? Joshua, I think he's thinking out loud while he prays. I think he's processing while he prays. He understood the mission. He knew what God had asked. God had asked, and he knew, as far as he knew, the people did it. So why did we lose? Why were we routed? Why were some killed? Why, God? Why didn't we stay over there just across the Jordan? Why come all this way to be destroyed now? Why? The Lord's answer is quick and to the point. The Lord said to Joshua, stand up. What are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned. They violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They've stolen, they've lied, they put them with their own possessions. That's why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and run because they've been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. Get up, the Lord says. Get up. Get off your face. In some ways, this isn't you, Joshua. It's not even me. It's Israel. And the reason, the why, the answer to the why is sin. It's sin. They have disobeyed. They have done what I said they must not do. They took it. They coveted it. They lied about it. They acted like my stuff is their stuff. And then he says something terrifying to Joshua. I'm not going on. I'm not going to move. I'm not going with you. I'm not going any farther until and unless you destroy what was taken. The sin had to be dealt with, and it would be. So he tells them, go, consecrate the people. Tell them, consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There are devoted things among you, my things. You cannot stand, Israel. You cannot stand against your enemies until you remove them and really the sin. So Joshua now has to deal with this. God was clear. How could they have missed it? They had to take it. They, you know who, but they, the Israelites, saw it, wanted it, took it, lied about it, hid it, and it's as if they spit in the face of God, as if they didn't care. They didn't lose the battle because they weren't able to take Ai. They didn't lose the battle because God wasn't able to give Ai into their hands. They had sinned. Sin came into the camp, and until it was removed and those things were taken for him, nothing would be good. And God would go no farther with them. Now, there is so much more to say, and I want to say so much more next week, but let me leave it there and then point out a couple things. When we get to this point in Joshua, I feel like I need to say some of the things that have been said before. I think I've said some of these things before, but they keep coming up. So if you don't mind, I figure God would love for us to know these things. So let me press them again. One is, there is always a relationship between faith and obedience. To some people, I know, faith is what you feel. Faith is what you believe. Faith is what you understand. Faith is what you comprehend. But in the scriptures, although those are true, faith is also what you do. It's what you do. And it's all that you do. Campbell tells a story about the founder of the Navigators. His name was Dawson Trotman. Dawson, I guess, had this military background and expected a lot of his own family. And he described how he would, at times when raising his kids, line them up before him from oldest to youngest. And he would start with the oldest and say, "What do your mother and I ask you to do?" And the oldest one would reply, "One thing, sir." And he would then go to the next oldest, the younger one, and say, "And what do your mother and I ask of you?" And then to the next oldest, to the younger. "And what do your mother and I ask of you?" And each of them would answer that. "One thing, sir, one thing." Then he would go back to the oldest again and ask the next question, "And what is the one thing?" And the answer would come back from each of them, "To do everything you say, sir, to do everything you say." It is possible that we need to recapture the sense of unwavering obedience to God, which means we do the one thing, and the one thing is everything. The one thing is everything, to do everything as He asks, to do just as He asks. God is asking one thing of you today, to do everything. And it begins with losing your own life. That's what baptism is. But it is surrendering, giving, sacrificing everything to Him so that He now calls the shots. The one shot, which is everything, and everything is the one thing. And how are you doing with that? The second thing to talk about, I think, is the same thing we talked about last week. I encourage us all to hold the God of the Old Testament together with the God of the New Testament because they are not two separate gods. It is one God, and He is exactly the same, even if He acts differently at different times. Hold Him together because He is one. He is both holy and gracious. He has wrath and goodness, and it is the same God with the same characteristics. The same God must punish sin with His holy wrath, and He also loves to forgive and show abundant grace. Did you know that? It's not one or the other. It's both at the same time. And maybe we wrestle at times with how that reveals itself, and you look at Joshua 6 and 7, and maybe you scratch your head. But I hope you'll hold both together because it is one and the same. Dick Clay, in his book, if you've read it, says, rather than ignoring inconvenient truths, we should learn to hold in tension the paradoxes of God's wrath and grace, emphasizing the latter without neglecting the former. We started this morning with Exodus 34. Did you hear what Mark read? The Lord is speaking to Moses in Sinai at the mountain, and he says this truth, and we read it. I hope you heard it. The Lord, he says, describing himself, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. I love that. Do you believe that? Mark read that, and I told him, stop right there. That's a great place to stop. It's true, you know. God is just like that, and that is a great comfort to us. But did you know that's not the rest of the story? God describes himself in that way, and he wasn't done. Yes, that's accurate. He is just like that, loving and kind and faithfulness and gracious, forgiving wickedness and rebellion and sin. But don't miss the next line. Don't miss the next line. Yet, he says, God describing himself, does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes even the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generations. The one who sins, the consequences keep flowing. God is gracious and loving and forgiving, but even he must not ignore sin. He is patient and long-suffering. He puts up with so much of what we have done all through history, what man has done. But at some point, he has to deal with sin. He has to punish it and destroy it. And sometimes he cannot stomach it even from the very beginning. So that's why you read different stories and you say, wow. Sometimes he kills some pagans who worship other gods, like in Egypt. The people who have oppressed his people, he kills them. And sometimes he kills his own people who stand at the foot of the mountain, the holy mountain where God is speaking. The people, his own people, who bow down and worship a stupid calf made of gold, acting as if that is their God. Sometimes in the Old Testament, God rains down fire from heaven, destroying the pagans living in horrible cities like Sodom and Gomorrah, wiping them out, Genesis 19. And sometimes he does it with his own people, where fire comes out from the Lord himself, destroying, burning, killing two named Nadab and Abihu, priests, children of Aaron, who worked in the service of the Lord. Sometimes God strikes individuals dead in the New Testament, a pagan king like Herod, Acts chapter 12. And sometimes, one time it's a Christian couple in church, Ananias and Sapphira, Acts chapter 5, kills them in church. And in Joshua, he has his own people kill the pagans in Jericho. And then sometimes, like we will read next time, how he kills one of his own families. And why to every question? And why to every place? Why with every group? It is sin. It is sin. The answer is sin. A holy and righteous God cannot tolerate sin for long. And listen, you need to hear this, and I need to hear this. Because those who sin and those who prefer sin and those who remain in sin cannot continue to stand before a holy God for long. Because he demands holiness. And Nadab and Abihu, while still smoldering, I guess, on the ground. Moses, who is their uncle, reminds their dad, Aaron, his brother, about the truth of God. God had already said it, and he reminds them the truth. Among those who approach me, he said, I will be proven holy. In the sight of all people, I will be honored. And we are beginning to see in the scriptures, in Joshua's book, that this sin thing we sometimes think is a small thing. This sin thing is not a small thing to God. Sin always mars a person, tarnishes a man, stains a woman, and condemns every single human who remains in it. And while it destroys the man or the woman, it also reflects negatively on God, and that's why He has to deal with it. I think maybe our idea of sin and punishment is flawed. Our idea of justice is twisted a little bit. Like this simple scenario. I might be driving down the road, and here comes a man, I'll say a man, in another car who blows past me. And right about that time, I know he is going way too fast. I might say in my own head, I hope the cops get him around the next turn. Until even maybe later that day when I feel like I need to go a little faster than the speed limit while hoping a police officer does not pull me over. And even if he does hoping he will let me go because I don't deserve the ticket. When we are speeding, we say we are justified, but nail him. Get her. Because if he gets me, that doesn't seem fair. We want our God to wink at our sin. Nail him, but let me off the hook. Do we really understand God's holiness and His thinking in dealing with sin? I think our idea of justice is somehow tainted because we think if God were a good God, He would let us go. He would let us off. He would let us go free. But let me give you a scenario that hopefully will never happen, God forbid. That someone in your family, maybe your own child, one day, finds that himself, herself, in the hands of a killer, a murderer, a monster. And what if the monster takes your child, the one you love, and hurts him, and smiles while he's killing him, and dismembers him, and throws him away like trash? They catch the monster, and you go to the court hearing, and you sit through all of those days, and you watch as that man, that monster who just murdered your child, sits there in that chair as the judge asks him questions, the prosecutor asks questions, and he answers and almost smirks as he answers the questions about your child and how he killed him. And then it all comes down to the last day when the judge says what the judge always says, this or that. And the judge looks at the monster who murdered your child with glee, and the judge says, get out of here, sucker, and don't do it again. Is that justice? But we think our sin does not mean much. Surely God could forgive our sin easily. Let it go. Pass it by. Send us walking freely. Is that a good judge who would let a man like that go? What do you think a good, holy, righteous, sinless God should do with sin? What should He do with your sin? I think we have underestimated God's holiness. I'm certain we have underestimated our own sin. And what would God do? What did God do? The answer to that is seen at the cross. God must deal with sin. He will destroy sin. He has to punish disobedience and wickedness, and He will. He has to make every wrong right and make just judgment. So when it comes to us in our sin, God cannot let it slide. He cannot wink at it and send you out the door, not for what you have done. He must punish sin. His holy wrath will come upon sin and destroy it. So what would He do? What did He do? Romans 8, Paul's words, inspired by the Spirit. For what the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh, God did by sending His own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering. So He condemned sin in the flesh. in order that the righteous requirements of the law might be fully met in us, who no longer live according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Jesus did two things. He lived righteously, which I could not do, and he did not sin, which I always do. Sin. God could have condemned me because I was in sin, but offered his own Son as a sacrifice, a sin sacrifice, an offering. So he condemned sin that was in me instead of me that was in sin. God brought his full and holy righteous wrath upon not me, but his Son on the cross so that I could be freed, forgiven, and saved. Jesus took the punishment of hell, all of it, for all of us, all of it on himself. As 2 Corinthians says, he made him, God made Jesus, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Incredible story of good news. Jesus took the wrath for me so that I could take on his own righteousness on me. Which leads me to the third thing, and I'll let you chew on this and we'll come back to it next week. In verse 12, there's a choice between devoted things to God and devoted things to destruction. Either these were going to be devoted to God or they would be devoted to destruction. And even humans had the choice. Will I be devoted to God or devoted to destruction? And that is still our choice. It was for Achan and it is for us. So are you holding on to what is actually the Lord's? Achan took some things that were God's and called it his. Big mistake, and it would cost him his life. What are you holding on to that is not yours at all? It is already devoted to the Lord. Your money? Your family? Your pride? Your sexuality? Your future? Your desires and dreams and plans? Your heart? Your soul, your life, none of it is ours. None of it is ours. It is already devoted to the Lord. It is his already. So, are you and everything you have devoted to the Lord today? Are you and everything you have devoted to the Lord today? If sin keeps you from a holy God, make sure Jesus takes it away. He's the only one who can. And if you are not fully devoted to the Lord, make it right today. Let's stand and sing. Come if you need to.